Hello and welcome everyone. In this video, I will talk to you about mediastinum. In this figure, you will see a lateral view for the thoracic cavity, in which anteriorly you will see the sternum and posteriorly the vertebral column. In the middle, in between, you will see the heart and arch of aorta, and of course there are many structures, but I think you can see a cavity as well, isn't it? Yes. So this cavity, or this partition or compartment that's located between the two lungs, of course we know that lungs are covered by a pleural membrane, either the visceral one that's adhered to the lungs itself, or a parietal one that's tough and not adhered to the lung itself. However, today we will talk about this cavity. Of course the heart should be here, but it's removed. So this cavity, known as mediastinum, located between the in the thoracic cavity, between the two lungs that covered by pleural sac. So let us define the borders of this cavity. The cavity that's, this is also a lateral view for the thoracic cage, and you will see the thoracic cavity. So this green cavity is the mediastinum. So it extends anteriorly to the sternum, and posteriorly it's bordered by thoracic vertebrae from T1 until you reach T12. So this is anterior and posterior border. What about superior and inferior? Superiorly, this cavity bounded by superior thoracic opening, or you can say superior thoracic aperture. Inferiorly, it's bordered by the diaphragm. Excellent. That's anterior, posterior, superior, and inferior. What else? Let us shift to this figure. You will see here the heart that's covered by a fibroserous membrane known as pericardium. I think you have an idea about it. So, and of course, the roots of great vessels and other structures. So this cavity, let me show you. This cavity is the mediastinum that's located medial to the lung, or you can say lungs, because we have right and left, that covered by, you see this white sheet? This is the parietal pleural membrane, or called parietal pleura. Let me explain one thing to you, which is, I think it's important. Look to the lung, and it's covered by pleural or parietal pleura, the white tough membrane, this one. Just in order to make it like easier to understand, and I would say also the innervation is different as well. So this part of parietal pleura, this one, that's located against the thoracic cavity, is known as a costal parietal pleura. And that one, this part of parietal pleura that's located against the mediastinum is known as mediastinal parietal pleura. So we have costal parietal pleura, we have mediastinal, and this part of parietal pleura that's located against the diaphragm is known as diaphragmatic parietal pleura. So the mediastinum at the end, located between the laterally bordered by the two lungs that covered by parietal or mediastinal parietal pleura, right? This one and this one. Excellent. Now, let us divide the mediastinum. Yes, it's a large compartment, but in reality, it's not divided. We divided it to make it like easier to understand and memorize the structures that's located there. So look to this dotted line, this horizontal plane that extended from the sternal angle. This is very important landmark in which the second costal cartilage attached to. You can feel it, yes. If you put your finger up the jugular notch and go all the way down, you will feel like an elevation. This angle is called sternal angle or angle of Lewis, which is very important. So just draw an imaginary horizontal line from anterior to posterior. You will reach the intervertebral disc that's located between T4 and T5. Okay, so above this horizontal plane, this cavity is the or this compartment is the superior mediastinum, and this cavity that's located below this horizontal plane known as inferior mediastinum. So above it superior and below it inferior mediastinum. Now let us subdivide the inferior mediastinum. We will not subdivide the superior now, just we will subdivide the inferior mediastinum into three parts. Anterior mediastinum, I would say A, this is small little space here. This is anterior mediastinum, and middle mediastinum and posterior mediastinum. So we have anterior, middle, and posterior. Those are subdivisions of inferior mediastinum. What about the borders of these subdivisions? Well, let us see what we have here. So for example, the anterior mediastinum here, bounded anteriorly by the body of the sternum, and posteriorly is the pericardium. This is the pericardium, the fibrocellular sac that covers the heart. Here is the heart, right? So this space is called anterior mediastinum, bounded by anteriorly by the body of the sternum and posteriorly by the pericardium. Now let us see the middle mediastinum. You know, it contains the pericardial sac and its content, like for example the heart and great vessels and so forth. Nerves, of course, like Phrenic Nerve. We'll talk about it later. And shift back to the posterior mediastinum that's located, you know, behind the pericardium and anterior to the thoracic vertebra from T5 up to T12. So this is the posterior mediastinum. This is simple. Just anterior to the pericardium and posterior to the pericardium. Let us return back to the superior mediastinum. That's located above this horizontal plane. I mean this compartment. So let us dig deep in that and define its borders. You know, anteriorly, the superior mediastinum bounded by the manubrium sterni, this part of sternum, that's known as manubrium sterni. And posteriorly, it's bounded by the upper 4 thoracic vertebrae. Vertebra is 1. Plural, you say vertebrae, right? So from T1 up to T4, because I think you remember that we mentioned that this horizontal plane that crosses from anterior to posterior from sternal angle to the back passes through the intervertebral disc between 4 and 5. This is not just for mediastinum, it's a very important plane for many structures. We'll talk about them later. So, as we mentioned, anteriorly is the manubrium and posteriorly the upper 4 thoracic vertebrae. Superiorly, again, the superior thoracic opening, and inferiorly is the horizontal plane. So these are the again the borders of the superior mediastinum, anteriorly, posteriorly, superiorly, and inferiorly. And laterally, we mentioned before that laterally is the parietal pleura. But which part of parietal pleura? The mediastinal parietal pleura. Mediastinal parietal pleura. The part of parietal pleura that faces the mediastinum, which is known as I mentioned before a couple of minutes. Okay. The contents, keep in mind that the contents of mediastinum, either superior or inferior, whatever, the contents of mediastinum is they are important, so keep in mind to memorize them very well. So what about the contents of superior mediastinum? So we mentioned this is the sternal angle. Okay, we talk about this level up, I would say, to this level here or so. So this is the superior mediastinum. The contents of superior mediastinum, let us start from posterior to anterior. Most posteriorly is the esophagus. I will show you in the next couple of figures these structures, because we will dissect the figure like deeply. So most posteriorly, I will start from posterior to anterior. Most posteriorly is the esophagus. Anterior to the esophagus, there is a trachea. And anterior to the trachea, there is arch of aorta and its 3 branches. So this is, look at the shadow of the aorta in general. So this is the shadow of aorta that descends back to the thoracic cavity. So this is the shadow of the aorta, and it's a 3 branch. This is the first large one from the extreme right, which is known as brachiocephalic trunk because it's larger than the artery. So this is number 1 from the right. It's called brachiocephalic. You know that brachiocephalic because it divides into 2 branches. The right subclavian artery that supplies the arm or brachial area, and the right common carotid artery that goes up and supplies the head. But on the other hand, still we have two branches, 2 and 3, which is the left common carotid artery. But here we have right? Remember. And here we have left. And here we have right subclavian, but here we have left subclavian. So, the right common carotid artery and right subclavian artery, those two arteries come from the brachiocephalic trunk, which is a branch from the arch of aorta. But on the other hand, to supply the left side of the head and brain and the left upper limb, these two branches come from the arch of aorta itself. Anyway, so we have esophagus, trachea, and we have arch of aorta and its 3 branches, and anterior to the arch of aorta and its 3 branches we have the veins. Let me show you what kind of veins they are. Okay. So let us continue for the contents of the superior mediastinum and the venous system block. That you can see that behind the manubrium there is a vein that crosses from the extreme left to the right, which is known as left brachiocephalic vein. This left brachiocephalic vein crosses anterior to the branch of arch of aorta, all 3 branches to the right, to join the right brachiocephalic vein behind the lateral right part of manubrium and first costal cartilage to form the superior vena cava. This is the superior vena cava. This is the superior vena cava. You know, the superior vena cava pierces the heart at the level of right third costal cartilage. Here we can see. Okay, here's where the superior vena cava pierces the heart at the level of right third costal cartilage. Right third costal cartilage. Okay, so that means the veins, I mean the left brachiocephalic vein crosses anterior to the branch of arch of aorta and join the right brachiocephalic vein to form the superior vena cava. Now, what else we have? We have the also anterior to the venous system. Here we have a thymus gland, or remnant of a thymus gland. Let us remove the thymus gland and see also this is a diagram that showed the nerves that exist in the superior mediastinum. Guys, we have vagus nerves. We have right one that descends to the thoracic cavity and abdomen as well, and we have left vagus nerve. Lateral to it, we'll talk more about both of them in this structure. We have a phrenic nerve that's, you know, innervates mainly the diaphragm and other structures, including the pericardium. We'll talk about them also. Right and left phrenic nerves. And what we have also, if we remove all of these structures and reach the vertebral column to the back, you will see that there is a kind of chain, like beads on a string, زي المسبحة يعني, which is known as sympathetic trunk, right? Which is apart from peripheral nervous system, autonomic nervous system. So we'll talk at the end of this lecture also. A couple of slides I have about it. Okay, it would be covered in the central nervous system in the third year, but I can't skip that, right? And this is known as sympathetic trunk. And also we have the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. We'll talk about it as well. But why not the right? Okay, those, either the right or the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, those are branches from vagus nerve. But you know, this is the right vagus nerve, and then it gives a branch that return back to the larynx. Here we go, this one. But we don't mention it now because it is above the superior mediastinum. But the left vagus nerve, this one, it descends down and it gives a branch that loops around the arch of aorta and ascends up. That's why we mention the left recurrent, but we don't mention the right recurrent laryngeal nerve of the vagus. Here we can see in this figure another superficial dissection of the superior mediastinum that shows the structures from posterior to anterior. This is the shadow of esophagus, anterior to it, the trachea, anterior to it. There's, of course, arch of aorta here, and it's a three branch. Anterior to the branch of arch of aorta, you will see the left brachiocephalic vein that crosses from the left to the right to join, I would say it's a brother, the right brachiocephalic vein, to form the large vein that known as superior vena cava. Anterior to the superior vena cava, anterior to the left brachiocephalic vein and part of inferior vena cava, and those root of vessels, there is a thymus gland or the remnant of thymus gland. Now let us see a deep dissection. Let us remove the thymus gland and have a look. Okay, again, those structures and nerves. You know, in the previous figures, the nerves were removed or excluded. Now we can see the two very important nerves, including the vagus nerve and, of course, phrenic nerve. This is the right vagus nerve, right? This is the right vagus nerve, and this is the right phrenic nerve. On the other hand, this is the left vagus nerve, and this is the left phrenic nerve, and we will talk in details about their pathway in the thorax. Look at it here just to keep it in your mind that the right and left vagus nerve both give recurrent laryngeal nerves. Recurrent because it returns back up to the neck. Laryngeal nerve because this nerve innervates the intrinsic muscle of the larynx. So both ascend between like a small, in the small gap or slit between the trachea and esophagus here and here. But we don't mention, as I mentioned before, we don't mention the right recurrent laryngeal nerve because this is a vagus nerve, and so it gives the close to the bifurcation of right common carotid artery and right subclavian artery. This is a branch that ascends as a right recurrent laryngeal nerve, which is above. It's that means it's in the neck, above the first rib, so it's above the superior mediastinum. So we will not talk more about it. It will be forehead and neck. But the left vagus nerve, it descends. We will talk about this pathway lateral to the arch of aorta, as you see here. And it gives, of course, it continues down, but it gives a branch that slipped or encircled or returned back below the arch of aorta and ascends up again between the trachea and esophagus, and it's known as left recurrent laryngeal nerve because it's in the superior mediastinum. We will talk about it later in this presentation. Again, also deep dissection, we remove the thymus and veins and arch of aorta and its branch to see the trachea and esophagus and the look. This is the left vagus nerve that descends lateral to the arch of aorta and continues down all the way. Then it will leave the descending aorta and accompanying with the esophagus and creates a kind of esophageal plexus. Anyway, let us go back and see it's a branch that returns on a circle back under the arch of aorta and ascends in the groove between the trachea and the esophagus to innervate the intrinsic muscles of the larynx. This is the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. Of course, the right recurrent laryngeal nerve, it returns back up in the neck, so above the superior mediastinum. This is the first strip, okay? Keep in mind. This is the superior thoracic opening. Okay, guys. Now, that's enough for superior mediastinum. Let us... of course, guys, I would say, the relation of the trachea and esophagus, the relation of the trachea and other structures will be covered in the respiratory system, I would say next year, and the esophagus and its relation and structure and every details about it will be covered after a couple of weeks in the GI system. Look at this very interesting structure here. This is the thoracic ducts. This is a kind of a duct that carries a lymph from the abdomen. It ascends through the aortic opening of the diaphragm. Then, of course, will be lateral to esophagus from the right, and it crosses the mid of the esophagus and it ascends up and drains into the venous system. It drains lymphatic, it drains the lymph from the abdomen. So it's known as thoracic duct. We'll talk about it. You know what? It will be covered more in the lymphatic system after a couple of weeks as well. So let us now shift to the inferior mediastinum. I will change the pen to the green. So we mentioned that it's subdivided into anterior, middle, and posterior mediastinum. It's a kind of moving from, like in a corridor, from the first room to the second room to the most posterior third room, from anterior mediastinum, middle, and posterior mediastinum, like moving in this direction, anterior, middle, and posterior mediastinum. This is what the inferior mediastinum looks like. Okay, guys, the most interesting and easier part of mediastinum is the anterior mediastinum. It's like a slit, a small gap or cavity behind the sternum and anterior to the pericardial sac. This is the pericardium that covers the heart. So we are talking about this space, anterior mediastinum. Guys, you will notice that one of its contents is the kind of a ligament, the superior one and inferior one. Okay, dig deep in that. You will see the ligament attached to the pericardium and anteriorly to the sternum. I mean here exactly to the zygotic process. And here the superior ligament attached also to the pericardium and to the sternum, exactly to the manubrium. So that's why it's called sternopericardial ligament. Sterno because they attach to the sternum, either manubrium up or zygotic process below. And this is from one side, and the other side, of course, attached to the pericardium. That's why it's called the sternopericardial ligament. We have superior and inferior one. Just if you, I'll let you know that the inferior sternopericardial ligament, known also as xyphopericardial, because it's attached to the zygotic process. We have also a couple of lymph nodes here in this space, embedded in the fat tissue, and the remains of thymus gland. Look at here. This is the remains of thymus gland. Here's the, I would say, the sternum, and just this space between the pericardium and the sternum. This is the anterior mediastinum. Okay. Here is another view. I think you remember this level. It's very important, right? So above it is superior, and below is the inferior mediastinum. Let us move posteriorly a little bit. We will move, of course, to the middle mediastinum. I will change the pen. So this is the middle mediastinum that contains the pericardial sac and its contents, including the heart. Look, this is the heart that should be covered by pericardium. And we have the origin or roots of a great vessels. I mean, the ascending aorta, pulmonary trunk, the lower half of the superior vena cava, and the insertion of inferior vena cava, and nerves. Look, this is the phrenic nerve here, the right, and should be the left one with pericardio phrenic vessels. So let us remove the heart. Still, we are talking about the middle mediastinum. We open the pericardium. You see this membrane? Yes, we cut this membrane. We took the heart out to see the other structures clearly. Look, guys. So what we have in the middle mediastinum, we have this stuff, fibrous sac, that known as pericardium, and the heart inside it. Of course, we have the root of arteries, including the ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk, and of course the lower half of superior vena cava and the termination of inferior vena cava. And you know that the superior vena cava, and tomorrow we'll talk about that, the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava both drain into the right atrium of the heart. Okay, what else we have? We have also in the middle mediastinum the pulmonary veins, either the right or left, either the upper one or lower one. So we have 4 pulmonary veins drain the blood, the oxygenated blood, into the left atrium. Okay, we have also, like, it's in very proximity, very closely attached to the pericardium, the phrenic nerve. Look at it. That accompanies a kind of vessels known as pericardio or pericardiophrenic vessels to innervate this fibrous sac known as pericardium. Also, in the middle mediastinum, we have a couple of lymph nodes. I will show you in the next figures. Very simple, guys. Again, we have the pericardium and we have the heart. Let me erase this. So in the middle, we have the pericardium and the heart and the root of great vessels, including, for example, the ascending aorta, and not the arch. This is the arch. This is just the first part, the ascending part. And the pulmonary trunk here, the lower half of superior vena cava that drains into the right atrium, and the termination of inferior vena cava that comes from the abdomen and drains also in the right atrium as well. And if we remove these structures or expose or have a look to the heart from the back, you will see the pulmonary veins from the right and left from the lungs, right? Okay, and laterally we have the phrenic nerve and pericardio phrenic vessels. Okay, so moving from the second room, or I would say the middle mediastinum, now to the posterior mediastinum here, this space. Okay, so you know, just the borders anteriorly bounded by the pericardium and posteriorly by thoracic vertebra from T5 up to T12. Inferiorly, I would say, you know, the diaphragm bounded this space, or the posterior mediastinum, anteriorly as well. So you can say that the posterior mediastinum bounded anteriorly by the pericardium up and the diaphragm below, and also the diaphragm bounded this cavity inferiorly. So let me summarize it to you again. This posterior mediastinum bounded anteriorly by the pericardium and the diaphragm, posteriorly by thoracic vertebra from T5 up to T12, superiorly the horizontal plane, inferiorly also the diaphragm, and on each side we have the pleura. Again, here is the posterior. You see a deep dissection for the posterior mediastinum. Here is the location of the pericardium and the heart removed, guys, in order to move from the middle to the posterior. So we have to, in order to see, the structures in the posterior mediastinum, we have to remove the pericardium and the heart. So these structures are located in the posterior mediastinum, and you know, look, bounded posteriorly by the parietal pleura. Look at it. This is the parietal pleura. Which part of parietal pleura? This is the mediastinal parietal pleura, because this is against the thoracic cage. Outside is the costal parietal pleura, and this part is the of pleura is the diaphragmatic, because it's against the diaphragm. Anyway, let us talk about the contents of posterior mediastinum. They are important. So, first of all is the esophagus. I like it. Keep it in your mind. So, the esophagus is located posteriorly, and it's encircled by nerve plexus formed by mainly vagus nerve, anterior and posterior, right and left vagus nerve. Right? These are esophageal plexus. And we have also here the, I'm going to use another color, the descending aorta, because this is ascending arch and then it descends in close proximity to the esophagus. This is the descending aorta. We have also a very important venous system, which is that known as Azygos and Hemiazygos. This is a zygos vein that drains the blood from the right side of the abdomen posteriorly, posterior in the posterior abdominal wall, right? It's formed, this azygos vein formed in the abdomen by ascending lumbar veins and right subcostal veins. They united to form azygos vein. And on the left side, there is not azygos, hemiazygos, right? Also formed by left ascending lumbar veins and left subcostal vein. They formed and ascend up. Then it will unite with accessory azygos, and they will join. There is variation. Sometimes they join each other, sometimes they drain directly to azygos. So there is a variation at the end of the day. Yeah. So what we have also, so we mentioned that we have the esophagus that's also innervated by esophageal plexus, and we have descending aorta, we have azygos vein. The azygos vein, it drains at the end into the superior vena cava, in the superior vena cava at the level of T4, at the level of T4. I stopped using the costal cartilage at the level of costal cartilage now because it's very posterior, right? In the posterior mediastinum, so it's closed to the thoracic vertebra. So we prefer to use the thoracic vertebrae as a reference. So at the level of T4, the azygos vein drains, pierces the posteriorly the superior vena cava and drains the blood in it. Anyway, okay, so what we have also, we have right and left vagus nerve, as I mentioned. You would see here the left vagus nerve. Where is the right? The right descends, guys, behind, look, behind the esophagus. I will talk to you about it. But the left vagus nerve descends in the front of the esophagus, but they form like a plexus from the back, posterior and anterior to the esophagus. When we remove all of these structures, we will reach to the sympathetic trunk that I mentioned before and their branch, including splenic nerves. Furthermore, you can see, guys, this green duct, which is the thoracic duct. Look, it ascends usually through the aortic opening in the diaphragm and lateral to the right, to the right of esophagus. This is the esophagus and this is the thoracic duct. Then in the midway, it crosses to the left, then ascends to the left of esophagus up. Look at it. Here we go. This is the thoracic duct that drains the blood, the lymph from the abdomen. It drains the lymph at the bifurcation between the left internal jugular and left subclavian. يعني عند نقطة الالتقاء هون, it drains, the thoracic duct drains the lymph here by an opening. Of course, there are many lymph nodes in the posterior mediastinum. I will show you in the next couple of figures. So let us summarize it. What we have in the posterior mediastinum. Simply, always remember the esophagus and the esophageal plexus that's formed by left and right vagus nerves. Excellent. And close to it we have a thoracic duct, and on the left side the descending aorta. And we have very important alternative pathway of blood, alternative, of course, to the inferior vena cava. If there is an obstruction for a reason or another in inferior vena cava, the blood can return through the azygos vein to the superior vena cava and to the heart ultimately. And so we have azygos vein and hemiazygos vein. And if we remove all these structures, we will see the sympathetic trunk. Okay, there is another view. Guys, this is what I'm talking about. This is a azygos vein that drains into the posterior part of superior vena cava at the level of T4, right? What's the problem? Okay, at the level of T4. Now we have also hemiazygos vein that drains the blood from the left part of posterior abdominal wall, and accessory hemiazygos vein that drains the blood from the upper part of the thorax posteriorly. Of course, they unite to each other, and sometimes they drain both in the azygos vein. Let me show you this. Okay, here's the lymph nodes. So mainly, most importantly, we have the posterior mediastinal nodes. Posterior mediastinal nodes. This is the sympathetic trunk that I was talking about. I will talk at the end of this lecture a couple of slides about that. But look, we removed, this is the deep dissection, which is close to the vertebral column. This is the vertebral column, the white shadow here. And you look, there is a kind of a chain. This chain with beads on it, which is a ganglia. This chain on the right and on the left is the sympathetic trunk. They were close to the neck of the ribs, up in the thorax, then they become closer and closer to the, that means they descend in this way, not in this way, sorry, but in that way. They will become lateral and kind of anterior to the vertebral column as the chain descends down. They form a plexus, pulmonary plexus around the roots of the lungs, and they form cardiac plexus and esophageal plexus here. So these plexus are important. Look at here, I like this figure. I will invest the time now. You remember the esophageal plexus that formed by right and left vagus nerve? Look, this is posterior view for the esophagus. What does it mean? يعني انت بتطلع على الاسophagus من الخلف. That means you are looking to the back of esophagus, not from here, from the back, guys. So you will see the posterior, the right vagus nerve. This is the right vagus nerve, because we mentioned that the left vagus descends in the front of esophagus. We'll talk about it. This is important. So this is again a cadaver that showed the this is the esophagus, and this is the anterior surface of thoracic vertebra. Here's the thoracic aorta, and this is the trachea, and of course the left main bronchus and right main bronchus, or primary bronchus, as you wish. This is the arch of aorta with its three branches, including the right brachiocephalic trunk and left common carotid artery and left subclavian. And we have lungs here, as you see, and the pericardium. You see this? The heart should be here, but the heart removed, and still we can see the pericardium, the sac that encircles the heart. Okay, here we go. Here we removed everything, guys. Again, this is the arch of aorta and its three branches. And here is the pulmonary trunk, because here is the ascending aorta, and behind it there's a pulmonary trunk that gives left pulmonary artery and right pulmonary artery. Anyway, here's the thoracic vertebrae and the ribs here, and this is the sympathetic trunk. You see, here we go. This is the sympathetic trunk with ganglion. And now we reach to the nerves located in the superior and inferior mediastinum, and we cannot ignore the two important nerves. The first one is the phrenic nerve, and the other one is the vagus nerve. So let me show you here where this is the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve originated from the anterior ramus of C3, 4, and 5. So it formed by those anterior ramus of those nerves and descends traversing the scalenus anterior muscle. This is the scalenus anterior muscle. They call it sometimes also anterior scalene muscle, but it's the same. Scalenus anterior, and there is middle and posterior. Anyway, so it traverses the scalenus anterior muscle and it descends. I'm talking about the phrenic nerve, and it descends lateral to the right brachiocephalic vein. Here is the nerve, right? Of course, posterior to the veins, and now it's lateral to the right brachiocephalic vein and superior vena cava as well, and it descends lateral to the pericardium and adhere to it to all the way down to innervate the diaphragm. This is very important nerve for the diaphragm. On the other hand, the left phrenic nerve also traverses the scalenus anterior muscle and is located lateral to the arch of aorta, and it accompanies, of course, as we mentioned previously, to vessels that supply the pericardium. Those vessels, arteries and veins, known as pericardiacophrenic artery and vein, because it's something related to the pericardium, and the phrenic, that means the diaphragm and so forth. So it descends also all the way until it reaches the diaphragm on the left side. So you notice that, of course, this is the first strip, guys, and we are talking about the superior mediastinum and inferior mediastinum. This is the superior mediastinum, and this is the inferior mediastinum. So this nerve, the phrenic nerve on the right and on the left, they are part of superior mediastinum and inferior mediastinum. Of course, which part of anterior mediastinum? The middle one, the middle mediastinum. So phrenic nerve exists in the superior mediastinum. Of course, it descends in the neck, but anyway, it's a part of superior mediastinum, or it's located in the superior mediastinum and inferior mediastinum. Where is exactly? In the middle mediastinum, middle inferior, I mean. Okay, so there is very important point, guys, related to the phrenic nerve. I know it's maybe rude to say that, but always remember that the phrenic nerves passes to the front of the lung roots. You see, this is the right lung and this is the left lung. Here, there is a kind of a root for the lungs, whereas bronchus, artery, lymphatics, veins, and so forth enter and exit the lungs. It's called lung root. So the phrenic nerve passes to the front of the lung or lungs root. Why? Because the vagus nerve passes behind the root. So the phrenic nerve is rude, I would say. Always remember that. Phrenic nerve passes to the front of the lung root. I will show you, I think, the next slide. But let me finish the idea of the phrenic nerve, that phrenic nerve indeed has branch, mainly its motor, and also it has sensory fibers. So the motor one, that when you say motor, that means it innervates muscles. The phrenic nerve mainly innervates the diaphragm. That diaphragm is very important muscle for respiration. And so the phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm, and also at the same time it carries sensation from where? It carries sensation from the pericardium. I mean, because it's very close to it. It's adhered to it. So it carries sensation from the pericardium and from the also diaphragm, and also it carries sensation from, you see this parietal pleura, the white sheath? This is the mediastinal parietal pleura. Also it carries sensation from this part, and also it carries sensation from the mediastinal, diaphragmatic parietal pleura, this one, that's against the diaphragm, so known as diaphragmatic parietal pleura. What else? Let us just follow the path. So, okay, mediastinal pleura, diaphragmatic pleura, carries sensation also from the pericardium and from the diaphragm, and also there is very important point here, but I'm not going to go in details, but you have to know that this pericardium, this sheath, composed from two layers, fibrous and serous layer. The serous is parietal and visceral. So it carries from fibrous and parietal layer, but not from visceral layer. It carries sensation just from the fibrous and parietal layer, not from the visceral layer of pericardium. Don't worry about that. In the next lecture, I will explain that in details, because the next lecture will be about the pericardium. Don't worry. Now, if you look to the inferior surface of the diaphragm, this is the inferior view of the diaphragm. You are in the abdomen and you look up. So this, look to the phrenic nerve, the right phrenic nerve and left phrenic nerve. The right phrenic nerve leaves the thorax through the caval opening, the opening in the diaphragm, through which the inferior vena cava passes through. So anyway, it accompanies this the inferior vena cava to innervate the central part of the inferior surface of the diaphragm, and also carries sensation from the peritoneum that lines the central part of diaphragm. Again, you don't understand, I will repeat it again. So this is the, let me erase it, okay. You know that the abdomen, at the first, the diaphragm separates the thorax from abdomen. When you go in the abdomen, you will see that the abdomen lined by peritoneum. The peritoneum lines also the inferior surface of the diaphragm. So this membrane that lines the inferior surface of diaphragm innervates, I would say, the sensation from this peritoneum that lines the central part of the diaphragm. This sensation carried by the phrenic nerve, right and left phrenic nerve. So in this way, we can say that, well, the phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm as a motor to contract and relax and carry sensation from pleura, mediastinal pleura, diaphragmatic pleura, pericardium, just the fibrous and parietal layer, and the diaphragm and the peritoneum that line the inferior surface of the central part of inferior surface of diaphragm. Okay, this is about the phrenic nerve. The next nerve is the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve, either the right or left, is very important nerve. Vagus, that means broad, أو الحائر أو التايه. It's the only cranial nerve that I would say bypass or extends to the or descends to the thorax and abdomen. It's the 10th cranial nerve. That means cranial nerve number 10. And let me draw. This is the first rib. Okay, that means this is the border here. So this is the superior mediastinum, and this is the inferior mediastinum. But the vagus nerve, it's located in the superior mediastinum. Yes, it's located here. Here is the vagus nerve. Okay, this is the left, and this is the right vagus nerve. It's located in the superior mediastinum, but in the inferior mediastinum, it's located not in the middle mediastinum. No, it's located in the posterior mediastinum. Why? Because it passes behind the roots of the lung. So, if you remember the phrenic nerve located, okay, in the superior mediastinum, but in the middle mediastinum, because it's in very proximity to the pericardium that's located in the middle mediastinum. But behind it, there is the vagus nerve. So, guys, let me show you the pathway of it. Indeed, the vagus nerve, first of all, in the neck, is located inside the carotid sheath. This is the carotid sheath that includes the vagus nerve and internal jugular vein and common carotid artery inferiorly, and the internal carotid artery above. Anyway, so just in the neck, you have to know that it's part of carotid sheath, descends up to the upper part of the neck, then it leaves the carotid sheath and passes on the right side. I will talk about the right vagus nerve. The right vagus nerve descends between the right brachiocephalic vein and right brachiocephalic artery. So easy, guys. And the right vagus nerve also descends in the carotid sheath, then it passes behind also the left brachiocephalic vein. So the vagus nerve on the right and on the left both pass behind the brachiocephalic vein. It's easy to memorize it. Behind brachiocephalic vein. Back again to the right. Okay, the right one descends between the right brachiocephalic vein and right brachiocephalic artery. Then the vagus nerve has a couple of friends. It was in the cartilage sheath. Then, let me show you. Here, you see in this figure, this is anterior, and this is posterior. We removed the right lung that's here. We removed it, right? So, you can see here that this is the right vagus nerve that descends, that was in a cartilage sheath, then between the brachiocephalic vein and artery. Then now, it founds a new friend, which is the trachea. Okay, so it is the friend of a trachea now. So this is the lung roots. This is the lung root, or the root of the lung. So the vagus nerve passes behind, this is very important, behind the root of the lung. Of course, it gives a branch to form pulmonary plexus. Pulmonary plexus. Now, the vagus nerve also, it left the trachea and it founds another, it finds another friend, which is the esophagus. Now it's the friend of esophagus, and also it creates a kind of a plexus other than the pulmonary plexus. It's called esophageal plexus. Please look here to the left figure. Again, this is the right vagus nerve, the friend of trachea behind the root, okay, and okay, it creates a kind of plexus, but where is it? The right vagus nerve goes to the posterior surface of esophagus, behind the esophagus. This is important. Look to the shadow. This is the shadow of the nerve, of the right vagus nerve. You see, this is the shadow of right vagus nerve. That means it's behind the esophagus and behind, this is the branch, behind the stomach as well. Now, it leaves, of course, the thorax. Here's the diaphragm. It leaves, because now it's a friend of esophagus, so it leaves the thorax through esophageal opening of diaphragm. So, let us move to the left vagus nerve. Now, again, this is a lateral view of the thoracic cavity. Again, this is anterior, because this is the sternum. And here is the vertebral column, I mean posterior. Excellent. Now, we removed now the left lung that's located here. We remove it. So we exposed the, or we can see now the heart, the pericardium, and the roots of the left lung. At the same time, you can see, guys, let me erase it, right? You can see also the left vagus nerve that descends lateral to the arch of aorta. This is the arch of aorta. It isn't lateral to it, and it gives a branch, which is because this is the left vagus nerve. It gives a branch which is left recurrent laryngeal nerve that we mentioned. We mentioned that earlier in this presentation. So this branch that's known as left recurrent nerve passes under the arch of aorta and ascends up between the trachea and esophagus. But the left vagus nerve descends again behind the root of the lung. But at the same, look, this is the phrenic nerve. It's anterior to the root of the lung. That's what I'm trying to focus on, right? The phrenic nerve anterior to the root of the lung, but the vagus nerve always behind the root of the lung. Okay. So let us move here. This is the left vagus nerve that descends lateral to the arch of aorta and gives a branch. Left recurrent laryngeal nerve ascends in the groove between the trachea and the esophagus, but it continues, traversing the descending aorta or thoracic aorta. You can call it descending aorta or thoracic aorta. So it descends to the now it's the friend, of course it was a friend of trachea, now a friend of arch of aorta, then behind the root of the lung, then now it's a friend of descending aorta, and finally the friend of esophagus. But the left vagus nerve, look here, passes and to the front, this is very important, to the front of esophagus. Look, it's the front, passes to the front of esophagus. Of course, with the right vagus nerve, they form a plexus, esophageal plexus here. Of course, yes, but I would like you to focus on this issue, that the right vagus nerve passes behind the esophagus. The left vagus nerve passes anterior to the esophagus. You can say, why? This is something related to the rotation of the stomach. If you move the esophagus to here, just twist it, rotate it counterclockwise، يعني بعكس عقارب الساعة لو زحت لهون، you will find that, okay, it becomes like that, and the esophagus, the stomach will be here, and you will see that this is the right vagus nerve and this is the left vagus nerve, simply one on the right and one on the left. But when the stomach rotated, the right becomes posterior and the left becomes anterior. Imagine, bring a tube, put two lines or two pins parallel to it, then twist it. You will find that the right pin will be in the front of the tube, and the left pin will be to the behind or posterior to the tube. That's why the right vagus nerve behind the esophagus and left vagus nerve in the front of it, they descend this in the same sequence, supplying the stomach and all the way to a small intestine, large intestine, until you reach the distal 1/3 of transverse colon. Okay, now what we have here, and there are a couple of branches for the especially left vagus nerve in the thorax. The most important one, which is the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, and there are a couple of plexuses formed in the thorax between right and or by right and left vagus nerves. So for the left vagus nerve, you know, that descends lateral to the arch of aorta and descends traversing the thoracic trunk, then anterior to the esophagus. It gives a branch again and again, as called left recurrent laryngeal nerve, that ascends up between a small gap or a slit between the trachea and esophagus up to the larynx. So it supplies all intrinsic muscles of larynx except cricothyroid muscle. Anyway, cricothyroid muscle is innervated by the superior laryngeal nerve, which is also a branch of vagus nerve, but this is another story. It will be covered in the respiratory system. However, what I want to say that the left vagus nerve and even right, they supply the of course the heart, and of course the esophagus, making like a plexus around, and trachea as well, especially the involuntary muscle of trachea, and of course the larynx in the neck, which is through the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. So there is important point clinically here I would like to know. Look to this nerve again, the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. It passes through a small window. This window between the arch of aorta and pulmonary trunk. This window called aortopulmonary window. Pulmonary trunk, I mean, right? Aortopulmonary window. In case if there is a kind of a pathological mass or tumor here, it's tight slit, tight space, tight window. So if there is a pathological mass or so, it will create a kind of pressure on this recurrent laryngeal left recurrent laryngeal nerve that goes up, and this will create a kind of paralysis to the left vocal cord and hoarseness of the voice. Look to this ligamentum arteriosum. That was a small artery through which the blood, oxygenated blood in the inferior, comes from right atrium, right ventricle, then it should be pumped to the lungs, but the lungs are non-functional, not yet, and also it's oxygenated, so no need to go to the lungs. So the blood will be shifted immediately to the arch of aorta and to the whole body of the fetus. Anyway, this ligamentum arteriosum, we'll talk later about it, but it becomes like a ligament known as ligamentum arteriosum after birth. However, the left recurrent laryngeal nerve passes behind this ligament, behind the ligamentum arteriosum. So I would like to mention also that both right and left vagus nerves create kind of plexus, pulmonary plexus, esophageal plexus, cardiac plexus, and they carry a kind of a sensation, visceral sensation from the not the thorax, but also from the abdomen, that's related to physiological processes and the reflexes activity, but there is no transmission for pain sensation. So vagus nerve doesn't transmit pain sensation. The last most posterior important part in our body, which is located in both superior mediastinum, like vagus and the phrenic nerve, but posterior mediastinum as well. So this part or this part of the peripheral nervous system exactly is a part of autonomic division of peripheral nervous system. It's called the sympathetic trunk. It's a kind of cord, nerve cords, punctuated by ganglia. So in our case, we talk about the thorax. So there are about 11 to 12 ganglia, and we have two cords, one on the right and one on the left. They are a continuation of cervical trunks, and they continue below, because you know, the diaphragm, then here is the border of the abdomen. So this part is the lumbar part of sympathetic trunk. So we concern today with the thoracic part, guys, and you see we have two cords parallel at the first in the upper part of the thorax. They are, let me erase it, they are descend near the neck of the ribs, because this is the rib and this is the head of the rib and this is the neck angle and shaft and so forth, you know that. So first, in the upper part of the thorax, the cord descends like near the neck of the rib or ribs, and they become like approximate each other toward the vertebral column until they become a little bit like anterolateral to it, right? And if you notice here, they have connections with the intercostal nerves, right? So they take branch from the intercostal nerves. So they connected by something called, you see, two branches to the ganglia, gray and white rami communicants. Let us dig deep in that. So this is the cervical part of sympathetic trunk, but this is the first strip, so we're concerned with the thoracic part that passes, of course, to the front of the first strip. This is the first strip, and this is also the first strip. Look, this is the first strip, so it's in the front of the neck of the first strip and other ribs until, you know, gradually they move close to the vertebral column and terminates. The thoracic part, I mean, the thoracic trunk terminates by passing through the diaphragm, exactly under the medial arcuate ligament, right, to the abdomen and continue as a lumbar part. So, in the upper part of the thorax, as I mentioned, this is in the anterior to the neck, and yeah, I mentioned that, no need. Okay, so there are branches of sympathetic trunk. If you look in the if you look to the upper part of the sympathetic trunk, look 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Upper ganglion, they receive a branch, look, from the intercostal nerve with white and gray communicant, because, you know, they receive through white rami and they give it through gray communicant. Let me explain to you. This is the, for example, the intercostal nerve, this one, for example, right? So there is two branch, gray and white ramus, gray ramus and white ramus, and there is a ganglion. This is a ganglion. This is one. This is a ganglion that located on the sympathetic trunk. So, from, for example, the white communicant or white ramus, there is a fiber from intercostal nerve enter the ganglion, creates kind of synapses in the ganglion, and it gives so this part is the preganglionic fiber because it's before the ganglion. Now after synapses, this fiber, which is usually unmyelinated, that's why it has the gray color. So these fiber, the postganglionic fiber, will go out from the ganglion like this, right guys? Creating a kind of plexus like pulmonary plexus or esophageal plexus or cardiac plexus, and the plexus around the descending aorta, or they call it sometimes thoracic aorta. So the postganglionic fibers in the upper 5 ganglia, it creates a kind of post fibers around pulmonary plexus, around esophagus, descending aorta, and lungs and heart. Now, we mentioned at the beginning that we have 11 to 12 ganglia. Okay, we finished the 5 and we showed the results. Now, what about the rest of the ganglion? Okay, from 5 to 9 ganglion, you know, the fibers, they give a kind of preganglionic fibers. That means the fibers from intercostal nerve will pass through the ganglion and continues down, creating a kind of something called splanchnic nerve, like greater. We have greater, we have lesser, and we have least. From the ganglion from 5 to 9, it create a kind of splanchnic nerve known as greater. Look, let us follow these nerves. Here, these nerves descends, guys, to the abdomen. Now, the ganglia number 11, 10, and 11 create a kind of another nerve fibers known as lesser splanchnic nerve. And the last one, number 12, creates a fiber, a kind of known as least splanchnic nerve. So, the upper 5 ganglia, it creates a thoracic sympathetic trunk, right? Or plexuses to the heart, lung, esophagus, and thoracic aorta in the thorax. But from 5 up to 12, those ganglion, it create a kind of splanchnic nerves, greater, lesser, and least, and all the innervate the abdomen. They descend to the abdomen. Thank you, guys. Thanks for listening, and I hope you find value in it. Thank you.